The wind howled like a warning, and the snow fell so heavily it seemed to swallow the road whole. We were driving in the dead of night, the darkness pressing in on all sides, when something shifted in the air. Was it the storm, or was there something else out there, something hidden by the blinding snow? My hands gripped the wheel, heart racing as the world around us became a blur. What if the worst wasn't the storm, but what lay beyond it? Keep listening to find out if we made it through, or if something far darker was waiting for us in the whiteout. But before we get lost in the shadows, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss out our chilling upcoming episodes. If you're enjoying our eerie stories, leave a like, drop a comment, and share the terror with others. And for even more eerie content, follow us on social media. Keep the fear alive. Thanks for joining me on this spooky journey. Now, let's dive into the nightmare. I was driving home with my family after visiting my sister, who lives in a nearby town. At the time, I was still getting the hang of driving. My stepdad had let me take the wheel earlier to practice handling the car on winter highways. So when it was time to head back, I drove again. The storm was expected later in the evening, so we figured we'd be fine. In hindsight, it's surprising they trusted me with the car. I had minimal experience, and yet here we were, speeding down the highway with a snowstorm on the way. We made light of the situation as the snow began falling when we left. At first, it was just a few flurries, but it soon picked up. In less than 10 minutes, we were caught in a full whiteout. I was driving in the left lane, and it was already 8 p.m. in mid-January, so the sky was pitch black. The snow was so thick that visibility was nearly non-existent. It felt like the flakes were filling the windshield, and the headlights reflected off them, making it even harder to see. The snow built up on the edges of the visor, and on that Canadian highway, the only light came from our headlights. Despite the rising panic inside, I was surprised at how composed I managed to stay. My stepdad was trying to direct me to a safer place to pull over, but with the wind blowing the snow everywhere, the ditches and lane markers were impossible to spot. I had two main worries. Since I was in the left lane, if I pulled over too far, I could easily end up in a ditch, and without clear lane markers, I could drift out of my lane if I kept driving. The only option was to keep moving until I found a safe place to stop. I used the rumble strips as a guide, feeling them slightly under the tires. I was driving at around 45 miles per hour in a 75 miles per hour zone. My stepdad suggested heading toward the road where his parents lived, hoping for a safer spot to stop. As we passed several cars stuck in the ditch between my sister's town and my grandparents' road, the storm only intensified and the sky grew darker. The snow began to freeze on the highway, and I could feel my tires slipping. The faster I went, the less control I had. Eventually, the road was completely covered, and I lost the rumble strips, forcing me to rely on instinct. Then, I hit a patch of ice at an awkward angle and spun into the oncoming lane. I quickly regained control, just in time to spot headlights coming toward us. It was a terrifying realization that we were in the wrong lane, but I managed to steer us back into the right one. My mum, who had been calm up until that point, was now panicking in the back seat. Suddenly, I was the one making all the decisions. My stepdad, trying his best to stay calm, seemed visibly more anxious than I was, but he refrained from grabbing the wheel in panic. Visibility was almost zero, but we eventually made it to my stepdad's parents' road and pulled over. We switched drivers quickly, and as I stepped out, the snow was already up to my shins. Since there was no way to safely drive home, we ended up spending the night at my grandparents' house. A few minutes after settling in, we learned that the highway had been closed due to the terrible conditions. The next morning, we had to dig ourselves out to get back home. I got to stay home from school since I was stuck out of town, while everyone else had to go in. It was my first winter as a learner and my first time driving in a blizzard. If we'd been in a smaller car, there's no way we would have made it to my grandparents' place. I was scared, but I didn't want my parents to see that, especially with my mum already panicking in the back seat. Looking back, I realize I probably shouldn't have been driving that night, but it was a valuable lesson that helped me handle such conditions much better in the future. It was an unforgettable experience, and one I will always remember. This was the first and last time I ever went to a haunted house. I live in Fort Worth, Texas, where every year a large haunted house event draws crowds from all over. This year, a few of my friends decided to check it out, and for some reason, I agreed to join in. I thought it was finally time to face my fears and experience a haunted house for myself. To give you a bit of background, I had a rough childhood that left me with PTSD, but I'll get into that later. It was a weekend, so naturally no one wanted to go without a few drinks first. My friend Noah hosted a pre-game at his house, 6 of us in total, 3 guys, 2 of their girlfriends, and me. We drank and smoked in Noah's backyard, thinking it would make the haunted house experience more fun. We even bought our tickets online while hanging out. I don't typically smoke weed because it usually makes me paranoid, but that night I figured I'd try again. I was feeling pretty good, and the mix of alcohol and weed helped calm my usual anxieties. After a while, we took an Uber to the attraction, which was about 20 minutes away. The line was long, and we waited about 30 minutes before we could get inside. The place was packed, and I was still a little cross-faded, but I stayed aware of what was going on. By the time we got to the front of the line, I started to feel dizzy, but I didn't say anything. Once we stepped into the haunted house, everything hit me at once. The actors were intense, and the atmosphere was suffocating. The flashing lights, the fog, the eerie sounds. Everything seemed to heighten my anxiety. I started to realize that being high wasn't helping me. It was only making things worse. One actor seemed to take notice of how terrified I looked and decided to focus on me. He was shouting, making unsettling noises and getting way too close. I could feel myself slipping into panic, but I did my best to keep it together. The haunted house felt endless, each jump scare pushing me closer to losing it. The flashing lights and the thick fog made everything seem unreal, almost as if I were in a nightmare. Then we entered a room bathed in a strange red glow. A man in a suit and top hat, covered in fake blood, was yelling at us as part of the act. But in the corner of the room, there was someone standing completely still, someone who didn't belong. At first, I couldn't place it. But then I realized it was my father's face. My heart dropped, and I screamed in sheer terror. The room went dead silent, and my friends thought I was joking at first. But when they saw the panic in my eyes, one of the girls asked, "What was wrong?" I pointed toward the corner, but when they looked, the figure was gone. Everyone was confused. They knew about my troubled past, so they understood I wasn't just messing around. One of my friends mentioned that the actor had even asked if I was okay. I was having a full-blown panic attack, shouting that I needed to leave. Noah quickly took me out through a side exit and stayed with me while the others finished the attraction. I didn't want to ruin their night, especially after paying for the tickets. Outside, Noah tried to reassure me that it was just a hallucination, that it wasn't really my father. My dad had been abusive when I was younger and left when I was 10, but my friends knew about it, so I didn't need to go into the details. After the others were done, we went to a nearby Wendy's to try and calm down with some food. I was embarrassed, but my friends didn't judge me for it. I went home early, wanting to give them space to enjoy the night. I was exhausted and fell asleep almost immediately. But because of the mix of alcohol and weed, I had a nightmare that replayed the haunted house scene, with my father standing in the corner calling my name. I woke up in a cold sweat, only to find him actually standing over my bed. He was a towering figure, nearly 9 feet tall, bending unnaturally. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing before I screamed again. My mum rushed in, flipped on the lights, and the terrifying apparition disappeared. My heart was pounding and I was in tears, telling my mum I had seen my dad. It was one of the most traumatic experiences of my adult life. Since that night, I've avoided weed and other substances, sticking only to light alcohol, and I can safely say I'll never go near another haunted house again. I spent much of my childhood immersed in the beauty of the Sierra Nevada mountains, camping and backpacking with my family. These formative experiences instilled in me a deep connection to the wilderness, which eventually led me to venture out on solo hiking trips in my early 20s. Some of my trips spanned weeks, with my father dropping me off at trailheads near Yosemite and picking me up in remote areas like Smith Valley, Nevada, weeks later. I always took precautions, carrying a GPS for emergencies, carefully planning my routes, and bringing a pistol loaded with snake shot for protection against rattlesnakes, which were common in the area. One memorable adventure took me across the Ansel Adams wilderness, where I decided to camp under the stars with nothing more than a sleeping bag. On the 3rd day of my hike, I reached a small lake as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Just as I was about to stand, I looked up to find a large mountain lion standing about 20 feet away. The moment felt surreal, awkward even, as I stayed perfectly still, calmly sitting back on a nearby rock while I carefully unholstered my pistol. I wasn't planning on shooting the lion. I knew that snake shot and tud rounds wouldn't stand a chance against a mountain lion, but the noise might startle it. In the eerie silence of the wilderness, I did the only thing I could think of. I started talking to the lion. I told it about my hike, the breathtaking scenery, and joked about needing to find a good meal, one that didn't walk on 2 legs. The lion's gaze never left mine as it paced back and forth. We had an odd, one-sided conversation for what seemed like hours, until the lion finally turned and walked off into the night. I remained seated, still talking to myself for a long while, trying to process the strange encounter. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, my knife in one hand and pistol in the other, my mind racing. When I finally drifted off, it felt like only moments before morning light broke, signaling the start of another day. The heat during my trip became unbearable. A heat wave hit, pushing temperatures above 105 degrees Fahrenheit at over 10,000 feet in elevation. Reliable water sources had dried up, and I found myself in a dangerous situation. I knew of some natural springs off my route, but they were 20 miles away. Despite the oppressive heat, I managed to reach my planned meeting point a full day ahead of schedule. However, a blowout on my dad's vehicle delayed him by nearly a full day, and the water source at the rendezvous was completely dry. Suddenly I was facing 60 to 72 hours of intense heat with little water. In desperation, I rigged up a solar still using a plastic bag wrapped around some plants, which provided just enough moisture to survive. When my dad finally arrived, I was severely dehydrated and hallucinating. He arrived with a cooler packed with Gatorade, vitamin water, and protein bars, which helped revive me. Afterward, I made a trip to the doctor in Carson City to ensure there was no lasting damage. The heat wave hadn't been predicted, and it was clear there was little I could have done differently to prepare. That trip was one of many adventures I'd undertaken in the wild, but it was also a turning point. After seeing the risks I faced firsthand, my wife made it clear she didn't want me undertaking long solo trips again. Her concern for my safety led me to rethink how I approached my wilderness adventures. While I still love the outdoors, I've learned to prioritize safety and companionship, ensuring that my adventures are as safe as they are thrilling. A few years ago, my grandfather passed away, and we had always shared a special bond. This past July, on what would have been his birthday, I felt the need to visit his grave. His final resting place, alongside my grandmother, was located in a cemetery about an hour away from my apartment. While my family lived closer and had already gone to visit, I had to make the drive alone. The day was dreary, with rain pouring down steadily, which only added to the somber atmosphere of the cemetery. Upon arrival, I was greeted by the gatekeeper, who asked for the plot number. After providing it, he gave me access. The cemetery was vast, and though I had visited a few times before, I was unfamiliar with the layout since I had never driven there myself. It took me a while to locate my grandfather's grave, and the place was eerily quiet, with hardly anyone else around, likely due to the rainy weather. Finally, I found his gravestone, parked my car nearby, and placed some flowers at its base. I closed my eyes for a moment and said a prayer. When I opened them again, something unusual caught my eye. Across the cemetery, several rows of graves away, I saw an old man standing still and staring directly at me. I knew immediately who it was. It was my grandfather. But that didn't make sense. He had passed away years ago. My heart skipped a beat, and I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off what I thought I had just seen. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. Was it some kind of spiritual experience? Or had my mind simply played a trick on me? Either way, a chill ran through me, and I was overcome by a strange sense of unease. I quickly whispered, "I love you, Grandpa," then hurried back to my car and drove away. On the way home, I began to feel off, like a headache was coming on, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Prospect Road, the route I always took, was usually quiet, with dense woods lining both sides. Occasionally, deer would cross, but tonight there was no sign of life. As I sped down the road, something caught my eye, a figure walking along the edge. My heart stopped. It looked just like my grandfather. I couldn't believe it. I swerved to avoid him, narrowly missing a tree. The car skidded, but I managed to stop before crashing. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but standing by the side of the road was a deer, staring at me. I was shaken. I couldn't explain what I had just seen. Still rattled, I checked for oncoming traffic, regained my composure, and got back on the road. The remainder of the drive felt like a blur, and a strange sensation lingered in my head the whole night. I went to bed early, feeling exhausted but still disturbed by what had happened. Around 2 a.m., I was suddenly awoken by the sound of my phone ringing. The number was unfamiliar, and my heart raced. I answered, unsure of what to expect, but all I heard was static. I waited, and after a moment I called out, "Hello?" More static. Then, for just a split second, I thought I heard my grandfather's voice. Faint, but unmistakable. I froze in shock. My heart was pounding in my chest. I shakily said, "Hello?" But before I could say anything else, the call abruptly ended, leaving nothing but silence. The next day, I contacted my phone provider to trace the number, but they told me they couldn't find any information about it. They claimed there wasn't enough data to go on, but I wasn't sure I believed them. The events of that day and night have stayed with me ever since, leaving me with more questions than answers. Was it my grandfather trying to reach out from beyond the grave? Or was it all just a coincidence? I may never know, but every time I think about that phone call, I wonder if it truly was him. Have you ever faced something truly terrifying? Eerie Shadows wants to hear your story. Share your chilling experiences with us on Reddit, and together we'll uncover the eerie mysteries lurking in the shadows. If you'd like to support the channel and help us create even more terrifying content, consider checking out our Patreon or Ko-fi. Your support helps us keep the horror alive. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more bone-chilling tales like this one. Stay tuned for the next eerie episode.